to 100 years. So keep that in mind. None of this can be as definitive as other things in the past. Also, there's always a little bit of bias because every historian that close to history, like in the last 20 years, has to write a little bit from their own experience because they were alive most likely during that time. And it's going to be the case that we were all alive during this time period, and not just alive, most of us adults or budding adults. So this will be very fresh on our memories. I know it was for me. I tried to read a lot of different resources because, again, this was probably the most different out of all the time periods I read because, again, there's just so much that has to be interpreted as if it's important or not and worth recording in your history book because there's, so many recent things going on. And history has a unique way of weeding out the important from the not so important because the further you get away from it, if people don't really talk about it or remember it, then it's not that important. So things that we really consider important today might not be that important in 100 years. We'll see. So let's go ahead and start with the last session, session 14. I call this Current Trends because I can't really, like I said, it's going to be hard to give tons of concrete facts, but we'll just give trends, kind of like things that are heading in different directions from the 9/11 event to the present day, so 2001 to the 2020s. It's interesting that when most of us are older, when our kids and grandkids say the 20s, they're not going to mean the 1920s like I thought of the 20s growing up. They're going to mean today. Anyway, I got some goals as usual. Let's start with one. I want to give an overview of the developments of Christianity in the U.S. from 2001 to the 20s. And then we're going to survey the post-9/11 American Protestantism specifically. And we're going to discuss some major religious trends that are both new and old in this era. So there's going to be some things that have developed pretty strongly in the last 20 years and some things that have evolved on the same vines that have existed for a while. And then, of course, we're going to discuss the future. So let's start with the 9/11 event. I'm assuming, was everyone here alive for 9/11? Everyone? Lauren, were you alive for 9/11? She was a month old. Okay, most people here, everybody here was alive. Most everybody remembers the event. It was a traumatic landmark watershed event for American culture. Many trends in American religion and in politics that we were discussing in the 70s and 80s and 90s tend to intensify, and some of them even evolve and change after 9/11. For instance, the moral majority that we talked about in the 80s is kind of reborn into what's more known today as the religious right, even more of a merging of Christianity with American ideals, and less Christianity, if that makes sense. But also the moderate to liberal Protestants that we discussed that kind of came out of, they're not big on theology or the gospel, but they're Protestants that came out of the Second Great Awakening period. They're going to really, they're going to double down on activism and become more socially and theologically liberal. So you see a little bit of more of a divide in Christianity. So that political middle in the the American Christian world really begins to shrink. It becomes harder and harder to be in the middle, which is unfortunate. And the nation as a trend, all the historians I read, the trend, and you'll all resonate with this, the nation really heats up politically in general and heads down a path of division and political polarization that continues today. Now, that was the biggest understatement I've ever said in the whole history of the study. But you've all lived in this environment. Hopefully you're mature enough to rise above some of the fray and just see that you are in a cultural moment in a localized country, that these things happen in countries all throughout time, all across the world. But sadly, we are in a cultural moment where tensions are just rising in American politics and culture. And they've really, all 9/11 did was grab that knob and crank it up, just because there were more things being debated, more things being hotly debated, more things held very close, opinions being held very close by the right or the left or whatever political angle you might be working. And then sadly, Christians through this have been tossed back and forth. I'm sure you all felt that. There's a Christian voice in the right, the left, the middle. The left tries to invalidate the right tries to invalidate the left, and the middle tries to invalidate the right and left. And Christians are seeming to struggle with where to find their place in all of those things, because, all the different tensions do force us to jump around. That's what I mean by toss back and forth. You'll find Christians landing. I'll give a case study that there's back in the Obama era, we had the big immigration crisis. Christians were really struggling with that one because historically Christians and Jews are pro-stranger, and pro-immigrant. If you find an immigrant on the street, a historical Christian or Jew would feel compelled to take them in. But they also see the validity of a nation not having that as a policy. So there's this tension there, this forcing Christians to make decisions. And that's just one example of, 15, examples since then of just issues that our nation has staged that has forced Christians into the middle of. And I think it's wise to step back and be self-aware of those things. If you're playing into one of the other narratives, you just need to be aware that you are, that you are going along with a tune being played by somebody's piper. It's left, right, whatever identification that is. And Christians being more self-aware of that will probably be a helpful thing in the long term. But we do find ourselves pulled back and forth, and that's really gotten worse since 9/11. And I would say most of the books I read ended around 2018 to 2019. I haven't got a hold of a history book since 2020. So when they start writing that one's going to be a doozy. Because they thought 9/11 turned it up. 2020, was a crapshoot. That was recorded. I'm sorry. It was crazy. So let's move on to some things borrowed and some things that are new. I did not mean to play off something borrowed and something blue, but it worked out that way. So we're going to look at things from the Christian past that are borrowed and kind of continued, and some things that are completely new, that just evolve in the last 20 years in American Christianity. So if y'all remember last time we mentioned the megachurch, we're going to continue that discussion tonight. The megachurch obviously survives 9/11, and really that whole seeker-friendly, if you remember that term, is what the megachurch model is, that it assumes that there's everybody out there is kind of seeking for something, and if we make a church environment that's really conducive to like a coffee shop, a comfortable area, we don't really mention anything from the Bible that's divisive, and we just kind of make it loosey-goosey and warm, then everybody will just come to church, and we can slowly boil the frog, right? We can get them kind of Christian, and then a little more Christian, eventually they'll convert and be full-blown Christians, which is outside the historic norm of the church. But that whole model, the seeker-friendly church growth trend, it really does continue on after 9/11 and peaks somewhere around before the 2020s. So this is a very recent trend. Bill Hybels, many of you might have heard of him. Bill Hybels, a prominent figure in the megachurch world, really a pioneer of the megachurch movement. He grows Willow Creek Community Church to a peak attendance of 24,000 people in 2018. So these are churches beyond the scope of your ability to fathom in size. Certainly not churches of people knowing one another and being in each other's lives. It's, you got to find a small group of a small group of a small group, to get your church feel. But anyway, that trend is high in the 90s and continues right into the 2000s, and peaks somewhere around 2018, I would guesstimate. Other famous figures such as Joel Osteen, you've heard him, Rick Warren, T.D. Jakes, they all grow enormous churches with different cultural and theological flavors. We're going to hit on some of them. Bill Hybels is the more like nominally Protestant, just loosely evangelical. Joel Osteen is more like the prosperity gospel. Rick Warren is like that kind of loosely evangelical thing, not really one particular thing, but kind of Baptistic. And then T.D. Jakes is a little bit of Word of Faith, a little bit of prosperity gospel, a little bit of charismatic theology, rolled all into one. So 2020, which we've all had the privilege of living through, 2020 plus COVID-19 began a decline in the megachurch model. Now, I got that data from some Pew Research and other stuff like that. But again, that obviously remains to be seen. It could bounce back. We don't know. But for the most part, mega churches have been trending down since 2020. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. You pack 28,000 people in a room. You talk about spreading some COVID. That'll spread it. So that also, I have an opinion. I'm not a sociologist or a trained historian or anything. My opinion is that when everybody was forced to be home, the people that nominally went to church just to kind of be Christian as a fun thing to do realized, well, my life's pretty fun without church. I don't really need church. I go for the coffee and a pep talk, and I can get that. I can watch it online. So when they reopen their doors, even mega-ish churches in our town have struggled to recover from that 2020, 2021 reopening, because people have realized that, I've had actual people I know, quote, say to my face, like, well, I go to church, I can listen to it on the radio. I sit in my house and listen to it on the radio. So, and it kind of weeded out the Christians who were legitimately there to be Christians, to see other Christians, to actually study the Word. And so, on the most part, the megachurch model is trending downward. Let's also look at the global church. Something fascinating happens during this time period of the global church. This is a direct quote because I didn't want to overstate it. It's a direct quote from a historian. The most remarkable demographic occurrence in the history of Christianity since the early church takes place in the last 20 years. And that is this. In 1900, close to 85% of the world's identifiable Christians lived in Europe and North America. 85% in 1900. And in 2018, which is after 9/11, in this 20-year window we're talking about, in 2018, 70% lived outside of Europe and North America. The single greatest and most remarkable demographic shift in Christian history since the early church. So if you realize the early church jump when it took over the Roman Empire and how that launched it into European cultures. Now, it spread to some Indian, Asian, and African cultures still there to this day, but it mostly mass-produced in the Roman Empire and European cultures. Well, if you think about us downstream of that, we're just, the effects of that demographic shift has taken almost 1,500 years to work out. You can only imagine what this demographic shift might do. So who knows what the earth will look like in 1,000 years or 500 years. Now that Christianity is basically not Western, it's mostly Southern and Eastern, and they're doing amazing things, especially in places like Korea where they're a little more wealthy and industrious with their wealth. So they've done some insane missionary work. They have a movement called From the Sea to Jerusalem, and they want to evangelize from the Pacific Ocean all the way through India, all the way through the Middle East, back to Jerusalem. They want to go the full circuit, and it's Korean missionaries leading that movement, going into India, going into Pakistan, going in these places. So the future of America, the future of Christianity might look largely African and Asian, and it'll be interesting to see what their turn will be like. Seminaries are getting built every day in Africa and Asia, so a lot of interesting things going on there. But we have lived in a time period to see that. That's in the last 20 years. So you can say that you've lived in a pretty historic Christian moment. Western culture, however, as a whole, sadly, has continued to secularize, with previously popular expressions of Christianity finding less and less relevance. So the high frenzy, especially in America, the high Protestant watermark of the Second Great Awakening with all these explosions of different denominations and things, that's really gone. That appeal is waning, and America, and especially Europe, is largely secularizing. But what's interesting is, in direct contrast to this trend, the world is becoming more Christian despite the West's Christian decline. So the world will be much more Christian by the time if the West completely secularizes and paganizes. It will feel to us living in the West like the whole world is doing that. But what's interesting is it'll be a more Christian world by the end of that than it was before. So don't assume that the world's always been really Christianized and now it's paganizing. Well, no, the West has been heavily Christianized and is now paganizing. The world has not seen its heyday yet of Christianity. So that's good for us as Christians. A little discouraging for us as Americans, but again, our American identity should be way down that list of values, right? First and foremost should be your Christian identity. So as a Christian, we should celebrate. I mean, our brothers and sisters around the planet have heard the gospel and are growing and spreading that. And who knows, by the time I'm 80, we might have Korean and African missionaries in Greenville, North Carolina. Who knows? I think it would be great if we did. They probably would do better speaking into our culture than we can sometimes. All right, so let's look at this next thing. This one is sort of a continuation of a previous trend, but it's really a new evolution. So this is something a little new. The Word of Faith and New Apostolic Reformation, or NAR movement. I know that's a mouthful. The Word of Faith movement is a movement closely tied to this NAR movement, New Apostolic Reformation. The Word of Faith, really what it means, it's a movement that evolved out of the prosperity gospel of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. If you really boil it down, it's based on the belief that our words have power and can influence the physical world in the same way God's words can. It also places a premium on physical health and blind faith as the power behind healing and wealth. You just got to believe. It's very similar to the 80s and 90s name it, claim it crowd. If you remember that, I'm claiming that my checkbook is, going to be full tomorrow, my bank account or whatever. It's similar to that. It's downstream of that. It's a little more evolved from that. It is centered on health and wealth, but it's gone as far as to liken us to little gods. So when he says we're made in God's image, he means that we're literally the same substance, the same species, if you will, as God, which means you have the same type of word powers that God has. And if you speak over your bank account or speak over your situation, or if you're having a negative day, if you speak positivity into that day, then you have the power to effect change. It evolved out of the charismatic movement. It was founded by a guy named Kenneth Hagin, with roots in the teachings of another guy, E.W. Kenyon. They're the guys that kind of start this talk and thinking back in the 60s and 70s, and then later generations pick it up. We'll look at some of those people. The most famous of that second generation that really begins to boil this down, that you'll see and know on television, the most famous proponent of the Word of Faith movement is Kenneth Copeland, Creflo Dollar, and Jesse Duplantis. I don't know if y'all have ever seen them on TV. Other prosperity gospel affiliates, these people would shy away from calling themselves Word of Faith, but they practice many of the same things, and they're full-blown prosperity gospel, which is so similar to the Word of Faith. Those people that you might know are Paula White, Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, Joyce Meyer, and Benny Hinn. We'll look at those in a minute. That's the Word of Faith movement from a 30,000 foot view. Its sister, or clone in a way, its sister branch is known as the New Apostolic Reformation movement, or we'll just call it the NAR. Basically, what this is, a lot of those same people and some more people outside of that circle of the Word of Faith that are more into this movement. It largely consists of what you would say nominally or formerly associated groups with things like Pentecostal and charismatic denominations. So in the 70s and 80s, they would be Pentecostal and charismatic, but they wanted to take their theology even further, so they left those movements and started their own. And what they really left about, the reason they feel like that Pentecostalism and charismatic theology didn't go far enough was over this issue of these offices that ended in the New Testament. Offices like the office of apostle and offices like the office of prophet. So they're going to advocate for restoring those lost offices for the government of the church. And they believe, like the early apostles, they believe that miraculous gifts must accompany Christians to prove their authenticity. So I've heard this from a guy I'm going to show you in a second, Bill Johnson's mouth. He literally said, the New Testament promises when Jesus tells the apostles, you'll do greater things than I, that's for everyone, all Christians, and that the way you'll let the world know you're a legit Christian is you will have these accompanying signs that will prove that you are legitimately filled with the Spirit. So things like visions, healing, symbol interpretation, prophecy, even resurrections should be anticipated in this movement. Now, we've had people in our church actually targeted by a group closely affiliated with this group in Greenville. I have relatives actually currently being targeted by a group that is here. It's not a huge group, but it is a group. And it's really based out of the Bethel Church movement in California, which we're going to discuss in just a minute. But they take a huge emphasis on the way you'd go to a normal charismatic church or a normal Pentecostal church. You might have speaking in tongues. You might have falling out. You might have even healings occasionally. But this is even further. The healings are more dramatic. And you'll see even crazy stuff like grave soaking, where they want to lay on the grave of a dead Christian to try and soak up the anointing of that Christian. So they go out and lay in graveyards on graves to soak up the anointing. It's really a lot of New Age mysticism clothed in Christianese, if you want to get my opinion on it. But to give you an example, supernatural phenomena such as the falling of gold dust in worship services is cited as proof of God's presence. Bill Johnson's daughter, in an interview, talked about how gold dust fell from the ceiling for 8 hours in a worship service once, and it was a symbol of God's divine Holy Spirit presence. So I don't know. Apparently, none of us have ever experienced the Spirit, because I don't see any gold dust, and have never seen gold dust. Yeah, yeah. I'd be sweeping that stuff and be like, come on, bring on the gold dust. 8 hours of it. It should be about that thick on the floor. So anyway, that's kind of this new apostolic reformation stuff. The most prominent and famous of this movement is who I just mentioned, Bill Johnson. I'm going to show you his picture in a minute so I want to clearly identify false teachers for the church, but he's the pastor of Bethel Church in Redding, California. You probably will know him only because of Bethel Music, which is the media entity that really launched the church and Johnson to fame through their music production company. Now, if you've ever listened to a Christian radio station, you have heard a Bethel song. Bethel, and look, as far as music goes, quality, like talent and abilities, like they know how to write music that people like to listen to. And I'm not even saying that every Bethel song you go find, if you comb through all the lyrics, that song in isolation is rank heresy. The problem is there's so little doctrine or theology in the songs that it's almost hard to identify them as anything. But if you really take the entity is kind of dangerous because people, Google, oh, I love all these songs. They Google Bethel, then they Google this thing called Bethel School of Supernatural Ministry, which is their training center to train you to do this new apostolic Reformation stuff. To see, I mean, I can't name names, but I've had a close relative and friend that be involved in this group, and there's a person in the group who is a seer, who sees symbols in everyday things and interprets them to you so that God can give you a message. There's another one who's a feeler, who feels negative energy and positive energy, and the Holy Spirit's given them that gift. There's the gift of prophecy, where the Lord just says things in their ear, and they just know they need to tell you. And it's really, if you've ever heard of like old school cliche like fortune telling, horoscope reading, I mean, the tarot cards and all that stuff, it's that stuff. It's just wrapped in Christian foil. So anyway, that's kind of, a large reason why they're so famous and wealthy is because of Bethel Music. That's what's really funded their fame and their success as a church. Other entities affiliated is what that should say, not officiated, but affiliated with this movement are Hillsong Church and its founder Brian Houston. Hillsong was also launched to fame by its media music recording company. You've probably heard 1,000 Hillsong songs. And again, I'm not saying every Hillsong song ever written is from Satan or peeled off the walls of hell. I'm just saying that the entity they represent. There's a whole documentary if you want to watch it online. It's called Hillsong something Uncovered or something like that. It's literally, just Google it. It's a documentary of all the countless financial scandals and sex scandals at Hillsong, and it also kind of explains their brand a little more. Really, all these movements and individuals have ties to the prosperity gospel doctrines that I mentioned earlier, and they openly celebrate their immense fortunes, estates, income, cars, private jets, luxurious lifestyles. Like, they have no problem bragging to you, because in their mind, they're telling you that you can have this too, because God has given this all to me because I named it and claimed it, or I did whatever I needed to do to get God on my side in the issue. So they're happy for you to hear all that God has done for them, and it just turns into listing. Kenneth Copeland has one of the largest collections of private jets in the world, and he's a preacher. He flies them over his private airport, where he set up stadium seating for his church just to see his jets fly for him. If I do that, please someone just shoot me. So this is Kenneth Copeland, who I mentioned earlier. You might have seen him on TV. He's a pretty scary guy, but he's probably front and center of the Word of Faith movement. He's the guy who blew COVID away. If y'all remember the little clip, he claimed and spoke the magic words to tell COVID to go away. COVID didn't go away, by the way, for like 2 years, and it's still here, I guess. I just had it a few months ago. He does a lot of other crazy stuff. He does blood covenants with the Lord's Supper and all types of demonic mess. This guy's named Creflo Dollar. He's the one I mentioned earlier. He's a prosperity and Word of Faith preacher. He's all over television. And this is Jesse Duplantis. You might have seen many videos of him. He's got the largest house square footage in Louisiana, in the state of Louisiana. And he brags about it openly. He loves it. This is Miss Paula White. She's a prosperity gospel preacher, and she's also was Trump's spiritual advisor, something like that. Bless him. And then this is T.D. Jakes. You probably definitely heard of him. He's kind of not super into the Word of Faith movement, just a little more charismatic mixed with heavy prosperity gospel. T.D. is also really proud of his wealth that he's accumulated, that the Lord has blessed him with. And we actually have a huge influence of this in our neck of the woods. There's a big church in town that the minister was anointed by T.D. himself, flew into Greenville on his jet, anointed her, made her the next bishop or whatever. So sadly, this is rampant in the African American communities because it preys on the poverty of those communities and makes it look like, hey, if you do everything T.D. does, then you'll be a billionaire too, Joyce Meyer, She's a popular female speaker and teacher who is big into she was really big into prosperity gospel in the early days. She's gotten caught for a few of those things, and she's tried to distance herself a little bit from that, but those are her roots, and she still talks that way all the time, that your words and everything have power to determine how your mood is. And then, of course, you all know Benny Hinn. Benny Hinn's the guy who hits people with his, I almost said breeches. It's not his breeches, it's his jacket. He hits people with his jacket and heals people, and is super wealthy as well. That's the Word of Faith crowd. When I mentioned the New Apostolic Reformation, this is Bill Johnson, who I mentioned, with Bethel Music, just so you can see his face. Look, I'll give it to you up front. If you listen to the man, he's one of the most well-spoken, disarming, soothing voices you'll ever hear. Super great communicator, but really dangerous theology. And then this is Brian Houston with Hillsong. Again, he's more like loosely charismatic with some prosperity leanings, but he's big on the power of positivity and wealth and all that stuff. So these are movements that are connected to the 80s and 90s, but really evolve in a whole new direction. It's not just your typical 80s and 90s prosperity gospel or charismatic theology. It's taking whole new forms and whole new movements as it branches off. The last thing we're going to talk about is new and old. It's old in what it's connected to, but it's new in that it was very unexpected and didn't have a lot of indicators of its advent, and that's the resurgence of Reformed theology in North America, especially the United States. And I put the date on this between 2005 to 20. Who knows? Because it could fizzle out tomorrow and just be a trend. It could last another 100 years. It could grow and be stronger. It could shrink and be weaker. We don't know. Because again, we live in a time period where you just don't know where the future is going to take us, right? So during this period of time, this 20-year period of time, really, historically speaking, an unexpected development in the theologically conservative evangelical world took place. So if you remember, the conservative, when I say conservative, I mean theologically, the conservative evangelical world had a lot of setbacks, a few positives, but mostly setbacks. The charismatic world was doing all its crazy stuff that we just mentioned. The church growth movement was full swing, and you would think that there wasn't much left of the core of the evangelical world, but strangely enough, younger generations of leaders in the evangelical world, they began to return to historically reformed beliefs and theological trends. Now, if you think about that historically, that is an odd thing to happen, especially when I'm going to mention some of the individuals and the backgrounds they come from. It kind of came from multiple backgrounds. It wasn't like one denomination spearheaded a return to Reformation era theology. It kind of came out of multiple denominations and multiple leaders and preachers from different denominations. So it's an odd happening. But it's really hard. What I'm about to say, please don't take it super authoritatively. And whoever you're listening online, if you hear it 10 years from now and I'm majorly wrong, then forgive me. There's not a lot of data on why this happened or how this happened. Most of it is just speculation. So I'm going to speculate some, along with a few other people I read, but there is no concrete data for where tons of this came from, and really any of your guess is as good as mine in a way. But you also shouldn't take your guess super authoritatively either, because there's just the verdict is still kind of out on that. So I'm just going to say that many causes have been theorized, but many people I've read behind attribute the movement to a reaction to the decay of Christianity in the West and the chaos of the post-Second Great Awakening American Christianity. So American Christianity after the Second Great Awakening, if y'all can remember back 2 or 3 sessions, kind of remember it goes haywire. You know, everything is invented overnight, relatively speaking, in a 100-year span. Jehovah's Witness, Mormons, you know, and we all have lived downstream of all that craziness. And I have a theory, as well as others, that this return to reformational roots was inspired by, was inspired by younger leaders. When I say younger, I mean older than me, in their 50s and 60s, but were younger then, going, okay, something's off. You know, Christianity's existed 2,000 years. It's working in other parts of the world. It's worked throughout time. It worked in the early part of our nation. But things started going squirrely, you know, especially after the Second Great Awakening and the world wars and all the turmoil. And I think it was a reaction that said, let's return to some of our roots. What made Protestant Christianity great? What was its heyday, per se? What were its driving forces? And that led them to look backwards at key historic figures like John Calvin in Geneva. Very far removed from the American context, but one of the most prolific writers of the medieval and Reformation era. They also began to read Americans like Jonathan Edwards, you know, brilliant people, nothing like The Purpose-Driven Life, you know. No offense, Rick, if you're listening, but the Purpose-Driven Life, you know, is, I mean, if you read it, it's not an insanely bad book, but it's not an insanely great book. You know, it's just kind of a book, you know, with some Christian things in it. And that's the best-selling Christian book of the 2000s. You know, I mean, it's like, so that's the stuff we're writing. And I think some younger generations came along and are like, so were there other stuff written before, you know? And then you read treatises like Jonathan Edwards on the freedom of the will or the sovereignty of God, and, you know, you can barely read 3 sentences without having to have a dictionary because the guy's so intelligent, you know? You're reading, you know, John Owen, and you're reading the Puritans. And it just kind of seemed to coalesce. That's some people's theory, mine including. But what's interesting to note is that the movement was most strongly catalyzed by the preaching, teaching, and, of course, writing of several key figures who gained a voice in the evangelical world by focusing in fresh ways on, now, this is going to blow your mind here, the Bible, Christ, and the gospel message. Now, at this time, that was fairly fresh. And sadly, even in our day, that can be fresh in Christian circles. Now, I know you go, the Bible, Christ, and the gospel. You know, it's like, well, what else are you talking about? I mean, we'll go back and look at all we've read and studied. There were many things of debate and interest to Christians in the 19th and 20th century. And not always was it Jesus, the Bible, and the gospel. The gospel's authority had been largely undermined in secular Europe, and then by the churches in America, you know, the liberal Protestant churches that went right along with it without any self-reflection. Well, now, you know, as academia catches up in the Christian world, the Bible is seen as much more academically reliable. Things like biblical theology make their way into evangelical culture in America. And people can understand the Bible in ways they couldn't before with a literal, strict reading or maybe a presuppositional reading. All of these kind of contribute to this freshness that some key leaders had when they focus on the Bible, Christ, and the gospel. And you see a huge response among 30-year-olds, 20-year-olds, and down. From this generation slightly above them of preachers and teachers and writers. Some of these key figures I'm going to list just so you can know them. This first guy, his name is C.J. Mahaney. He's a good example of the oddness of this movement. Now, he's had some issues in later years. I'm not putting him up here as somebody you should adore, but just academically speaking, C.J.'s story is, you know, he comes out on stage one day at a mega church. He's a mega church pastor in a charismatic movement. And he literally walks out on stage and says something to the effect, guys, I'm sorry. I've been reading the Bible. I've been reading a lot of historians and theologians of the past, and I just really don't think we're doing church the way the Bible says. And I've been a large part of that problem, and I'm sorry. And he resigns and leaves his mega church salary and winds up starting the brand of churches you know as the Sovereign Grace Church Network, where they're more Calvinistic, somewhat Reformed, especially in their soteriology, have a little bit of charismatic things they kept, but basically very gospel-centered is the positive, although I might disagree with them on other things. But that's the kind of oddness of this movement, is a guy who it's not really in his best interest to change, but was genuinely moved by the scriptures and what he felt like the Bible was saying about church, and just didn't see it in his own megachurch that he started. So I thought it was pretty mature of him, pretty bold of him. And he goes on to be a pretty prominent speaker and a really prominent writer. He's written some really popular books that kind of catalyzed this movement. That he wrote a book called Cross-Centered Living or something like that, that eventually became what we know as the tagline Gospel-Centered. It's basically just orienting your life around Jesus and his work on the cross. And again, historically speaking, that shouldn't be super odd, but at this cultural moment, it was very fresh for a whole new generation. Another man, probably one of the singular most used by God speakers. This one he was a writer and a speaker, but a writer. And this man's also a writer, but he's famous for his preaching. And that's John Piper. Many of you might have heard of him. He was just a nerdy, I hope he never hears that, but he was a nerdy, bookish theologian who studied at the University of Munich. He came back, has an earned doctorate from the University of Munich. He came back and taught New Testament and was asked randomly by Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to pastor their church. And he never really thought of himself as a pastor, but he decided to do it. And when he does it, he's this historically pretty Reformed Baptist guy who's now in a preaching context. And he just found himself to be, if you've ever heard him, he's one of the most passionate speakers you ever, it's almost like you could never mimic him because he's way over the top. But he means it. If you've watched him at all, he's very fervent in how he speaks. And somewhere along the line, he wrote a book called Desiring God that really launched him to international evangelical fame or recognition. The premise of the book is that God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in him. And he got known for that tagline. And he builds a lot of the book off of the influence of Jonathan Edwards in his life. And Piper goes on to be invited to speak at the famous conference for young people known as Passion, which has 40,000 20-year-olds there. And it wasn't because he was particularly in line with everything that might go on at a Passion conference, but he preached really fervently about Jesus, so they wanted him there, and that gave him even more exposure to a whole generation that heard the way he talked about God and his sovereignty and salvation and the Bible and the gospel, and made them look him up and read his books. And, it really kind of was a catalyst for a lot of younger people in the Baptist world to begin hearing anew a lot of the reformational, theology that came, from 500 years before. This next guy is R.C. Sproul, Blake's spiritual granddaddy. That's how he sees it. You might have heard a video from R.C. R.C. is a Presbyterian minister, so we've got a charismatic, we've got a Baptist, and we've got a Presbyterian already on the screen. And he's a Presbyterian minister who really started he didn't become a minister until later, but he was in the PCA denomination. And he started a teaching ministry called Ligonier Ministry, still exists to this day, where he just recorded teaching on everything from church history to theology to basically from a reformational perspective, Christian theology. And you can, to this day, you can watch, he's passed away now, sadly, but to this day you can watch the people that have carried on after him. But he had a wide reading, a wide reception. He was really understandable. R.C.'s gift was he could take crazy complex things like the sovereignty of God and the will of man and explain it. And you could understand it as a 10-year-old, like a 15-year-old. Like, you could show it to your kids. And he was just down to earth. He's a really blue-collar sounding guy. He didn't try and talk over your head. And he took a lot of those dense reformational doctrines and made them more palatable and understandable and digestible for the populace, for the bottom shelf. And that was this is all going on around the same time. Now, he started way back in the late 70s, early 80s, but still, it really got going in this time period, and they had their several national conferences that were widely attended from people from multiple denominations, not just the Presbyterian one. In fact, most of his readership eventually was Baptist because he had such a wide influence. And then, of course, Dr. Timothy Keller, who just passed away this past year. On the board, probably the greatest influence on me personally. I didn't plan to get emotional. I don't know what's happening. Probably because he just passed. It was hard. All these men have had influences on me, but he probably the greatest because he had a unique gift to speak into the lives of those who doubt and struggle with unbelief. And I was one of those guys in college. I was a young college kid who was raised evangelical, fundamentalist. And when I read Reason for God, which was one of his greater books on the issue, it just was a fresh new way of talking about the reality of God's existence and things that I thought were archaic in my rejection of God, my atheism. He had a unique talent of speaking into that context really well. But he planted a church, was called in the late 70s, early 80s, in Manhattan. You heard what I said, Manhattan. He planted a little conservative PCA church, theologically Bible-preaching, gospel-believing PCA church in the middle of Manhattan. And it did all right for however long that is, but 2001, the 9/11 attacks really changed the whole landscape for Keller and his church, Redeemer, because he had carved out enough of an influence and a respect on the island of Manhattan of his church being a loving, caring, Jesus-loving community, not ashamed of what they believe, but able to speak it respectfully to those that disagree with them, but still not very big. We're talking about 300-400 people. For Manhattan, that's very small. And at 9/11, he had written in the New York Times and stuff, and he was invited to speak by the mayor randomly to speak at the 9/11, the immediate memorial service right after the 9/11 attacks. So all of a sudden, this little PCA minister with 200 or 300 people in Manhattan is on national television, praying to the whole world and speaking to all of New York City. And he said it was the single, greatest challenge he ever had because he had to share the gospel, get us to Jesus, console the hurting, and that dude gave him 2 minutes, So he had to get a lot out really quick. And he did a great job, and that really launched him to more prominence in that area. To this day, Redeemer has 4,000 attenders and like 6 locations on the island of Manhattan. Not including the boroughs, on the island of Manhattan. So the evangelical rate when Redeemer was planted was like 0.06 or something ridiculous on the island of Manhattan. It's now like, 8.2, which is significant when you consider how many people are on the island of Manhattan. But when you're on Manhattan, you have unique opportunities by the people you meet to spread whatever message you're spreading, if you're in business, if you're in politics. And they were in the business of the gospel. So it was a unique place for that to spread. And this is all happening, remember, post 9/11, coalescing at the same time. Another man that's widely known, and it was really known back at that time period, is the man John MacArthur. John MacArthur was a nominally Methodist, he wasn't really Methodist. The church he went to was Methodist. He was just kind of nominally evangelical guy who graduated from Fuller Seminary, was hired at a Methodist church. And he'd been in ministry for forever, since way back in the day. But as he grew in ministry, he began to do what a lot of these other people did, read books and stuff about the gospel, the Bible, his view of salvation, all these things. And he began to align more and more and realize he was a little more along the reformational understanding of those things than he originally was. And you can just see in MacArthur's life how he just reformed more and more and more and more until his peak of influence was really around the 2005 or 2000 really to 2015. He's kind of old, bless his heart. He's 7 or something. He's getting a little frail, but he was popular through media and outlets. He's written several things, and mostly his preaching. He's known for his very straight expository preaching. Another man, MacArthur's now kind of non-denominational-ish. Baptistic, but non-denominational. Then from the hardcore Baptist crowd is this man named Mark Dever, which many of you will know his name. He's had a singular, pretty big influence on our church as a Baptist church. Mark grew up Southern Baptist, was trained at Cambridge and Gordon Conwell, and just got a pretty solid evangelical training. And especially when he went to England and Cambridge, he got more of the Puritan theology, which largely influenced him through the ministry of other great Britons like Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who was the generation before him. He was listening to these more reformed preachers and thinkers and writers, and it really influenced him. So he was actually hired to become the lead pastor of Capitol Hill Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. And when he went there, it was a pretty traditional church that was committee ran and singular pastor ruled model. And he slowly kind of revitalized that church to a more biblically healthy model of a plurality of pastors, a healthy deaconate, a thriving membership. And to this day, they've planted, like 10 churches in the area around them because they capped their membership at 900 because that's how much they feel like they can minister to. And again, if you think about that in the vein of the megachurch model, capping your membership is insanity. All you want to do is grow, grow, grow. But at 900 people, that's about how many 40 elders can really minister to and know, and you have enough resources and people to constantly be planting churches. So it just made sense. I've been to his church, read many of his books. His book, What is a Healthy Church, had a huge influence on me and Blake personally to evaluate where Emmanuel was at on that spectrum of what the Bible describes as a healthy church. And not really his, but him and his group of friends that founded the ministry called 9 Marks, because his book is called 9 Marks of a Healthy Church. And they just write on things like church health, church revitalization, bringing the Bible and the doctrines of the Reformation to bear on the health of a church. And so he's had a huge influence by staying in the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention. He's indirectly had a huge influence over the Baptist world. So all of this is really happening at the same time. This last guy, some of you might know Paul Washer. He got really famous for one particular sermon that went viral. And again, that's that time period, right, since 2001 till now, about the middle of that, 2015, 2018, that's when viral becomes the thing. And he goes viral with the Stop Laughing sermon, if you've ever heard that. But he's, and a lot of people a lot of younger people heard that sermon and had never really heard a preacher speak that way to them about the gospel, to be that forward about the gospel, to be that passionate about the gospel. And again, I'm not saying that I agree with everything of all the people I put on the screen. I'm just saying that if you want to know this movement thing, this Reformed resurgence, you got to kind of know these figures. So the movement has had ups and downs for sure, with branches of it heading in different directions. There's Like I said, C.J. Mahaney's crowd has a little touch of some charismatic theology in them. That's not a judgment. I'm just saying that's the truth. There's other people like, Keller and Sproul would be more Presbyterian, but MacArthur and Dever would be more Baptistic. They all got slightly different nuances, and I think there's trends developing in each one. I won't get too detailed on all that, but really the strength of the movement, which is what's most important, rests in its emphasis on Jesus and gospel centrality and the historic moorings that were passed down to us by the Reformation and especially the early church. Excuse me. If you remember, that's the kind of stuff we lost in the first but second, especially Second Great Awakening. There was an ejection of all historic anything connecting you to the past of Christianity. I mean, there's whole denominations built on that. The Christian Church, y'all know of that denomination? It's a purist movement wanting to get back to the simplicity of the New Testament is what they claim. Really, it's a rejection of anything that's ever been handed down from anyone. There's many other movements like that. So really, what happened with that is when you lose a lot of that connection to the past and the historic church, you have things like the Jehovah's Witness and the Mormons and the Seventh-day Adventists and all these different things can crop up however they want, ad nauseum. So that's really the strength of this movement, is that it's all about, its strength was that it focused on Jesus, focused on the gospel, focused on the Bible, and the historic traditions that made Protestantism what Protestantism was pre-Second Great Awakening. Church reform, church renewal, church revitalization, similar to our church's journey, church planting, they've all come from this movement in different forms, and this movement has had a profound influence on the Baptist and Presbyterian world, and the non-denominational world. But I would say the greatest influence would be on the Baptist world, just numerically. And the question really is, we've experienced the benefits of this movement here. I would say our church, my generation, Blake's generation, even John's generation, that era has grown up with a lot of this influence in our lives. And it's been a huge part of why we have tried to go back to our historic roots of what the Bible says, what historically Protestants have believed since the Reformation and since the early church. I would say it's a positive movement. I really am thankful for it. Now, the endurance and the resilience of the movement remains to be seen as American Christianity faces new escalating tensions post-2020. The bottom line is, like with any movement, we don't know what the Word of Faith movement will do in the next 50 years. I'm guessing if we have a major economic collapse, it will lose its appeal and its relevance. If we have a boom, it may live for another 50 years. At the end of the day, we don't know. This return to historic reformational roots is a wonderful thing. We'll see. We'll see if it sticks. We'll see if it makes it to my kids' generation and beyond that. We'll see what remains of the nominally evangelical megachurch world in 50 years, 10 years, who knows? Those are all things that remain to be seen, because that's really how history works. But the good news is that I think we can see, even in this limited time span, that this movement should shock you, because if you try and reprocess everything we've already said and all the craziness in our nation's history, statistically, it's odd for you to be in a church that confesses that the Bible is God's Word, that Jesus is the only way to be reconciled to the Father, that there is life everlasting, that there's one holy Catholic Church, little c, that the Holy Spirit is real and active in the world. The fact that you're in that church, a church that believes those things, it's a testament to God's grace, to God's preserving grace, that now I can say we're finished. We're at the end. So here you are at 2,000 years later, and you're sitting in a room on a different continent from a different ethnic heritage from its founders, and you're a world away from where it started. But the message of Jesus Christ, the righteous, marches on. And you gather every week and hear it preached, and it still exists, and it's still been defended enough and preserved enough that it's even remotely coherent. And you can read the original manuscripts of Jesus' teachings and see that it's still being taught today. And I can say, as a novice history lover, that is truly a miracle. It's truly a miracle. Because so many things in the Christian history that we've gone through, and if you go through deeper, has assaulted the church on every front, from within the church and from without. And it should not be so that we are here tonight, statistically. But it is miraculously so. So what do we say about the future? It's simple, that the future remains in the hand of the Lord. We'll see what God does with the East and the South. What amazing things God does through our Korean brothers and sisters, through our African brothers and sisters. The West has had a glorious history, but also a brutal history and a sinful history. And we've kind of had our go. And I'm not saying I'm giving up, because I think Christianity can regrow in a wasteland just as easy as it can be planted in one. So that's what I'm hoping and praying for. But we've kind of had our chance to lead Christianity, some good things, some bad things. Now we kind of get to see what God does with the South, what God does with the East. And it should, as a Christian, be exciting, because we're not Western. We're Christians, primarily. Western is much later, and we like to move those things up higher than they should be. But we really do live, in a way, in an exciting era. A little bit of a frontier, because we don't know when all of us are 80 and 90 and 100, like me. Who knows? Probably not. I'm going to make it to 74. However old we live, you don't know what headlines you'll be reading. You just don't. And that really is a beautiful thing. So praise God. He's preserved His church. The gates of hell have not prevailed against it. So I can tell you right now that promise, theoretically, it could fail tomorrow. It could all fall apart tomorrow. But I can tell you right now, I got 2,000 years of data that the hell has not prevailed thus far. And I have the same amount of confidence that it will not in the future either. So I hope you praise Jesus, praise God, and praise His Spirit through this process. So let's close in a word of prayer.